Good Thursday morning, Patriots, and welcome back to O'Connor's Right Stand. I'm your host, John O'Connor, software engineer by day, conservative truth seeker by night. Today, I'm coming to you with a heavy heart and a fire lit in my belly about something that happened yesterday morning. That should honestly shake every American to their core. And honestly, I just want to say that I'm not exactly sure how this episode is going to come across. If you're a loyal listener, you likely are aware I've never covered a topic of such horror. I'm sad, angry, and frustrated. That all being said, my prayers are with all involved, and I wish healing to all. Before we dive into what really happened in Minneapolis yesterday, I need to share something that's been weighing on my mind. We live in a culture that has systemically removed consequences from evil actions, while simultaneously removing protection from innocent people. Think about this. We've created a society where we bend over backwards to understand and empathize with people who commit the most heinous acts imaginable, while we tell law-abiding citizens they need to surrender their means of self-protection. Here's the brutal truth that nobody wants to face. Evil exists. It's real, it's active, and it specifically targets innocents. You can't therapize it away. You can't regulate it into submission. And you certainly can't stop it by disarming its potential victims. The only thing that stops evil is good people who are prepared to meet it with overwhelming force. An 8 and 10-year-old were murdered today while they were praying. Let that sink in for a second. They were literally praying when evil walked through those church doors. And before their bodies were even cold, the same politicians who spent decades making schools soft targets were already on social media demanding we make them even softer. This isn't just another tragic news story. This is a crystallization of everything wrong with how we protect our most vulnerable citizens, how we cover acts of terrorism, and how we respond to hate crimes when they don't fit the approved narrative. Today, we're going to break down exactly what happened in Minneapolis, who this attacker really was, what the manifesto reveals about the motivation, why the FBI immediately called this a hate crime while the media refuses to, and most importantly, how the quote-unquote "it's the guns" narrative started before the children's families even knew their babies were gone. Ready to see how evil operates and how the establishment protects it? The Right Stand starts now. Here's what the media hopes you won't piece together about yesterday morning's attack on Catholic children. Because once you see the full picture, their entire narrative about random gun violence falls apart completely. At 8:30 a.m. yesterday, during morning mass at Annunciation Catholic School in South Minneapolis, a 23-year-old individual armed with a rifle, shotgun, and pistol opened fire throughout the church's stained glass windows. 2 children, an 8-year-old and a 10-year-old, were killed where they sat in the pews. 17 other people were shot, including 14 children ranging from the age of 6 to 15, and 3 adults in their 80s. But here's what makes this even more evil. This wasn't some random act of violence. The attacker specifically targeted children during prayer time, fired dozens of rounds through church windows, and had prepared by attempting to barricade doors to prevent escape. One young survivor described being just 2 feet away from the stained glass windows when the shooting started. Watched his friend get shot in the back. The attacker was found dead in the back of the church from a self-inflicted gunshot wound, but not before posting a timed manifesto to YouTube that reveals that this was a carefully planned hate crime against Catholics and children. We'll get to what that manifesto actually contains, because it's far worse than anything the mainstream media is reporting. Minneapolis Police Chief Brian O'Hara confirmed that all firearms were purchased legally and recently. The Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, Firearms, and Explosives has the weapons in their possession, and the FBI immediately classified this as an act of domestic terrorism and hate crimes targeting Catholics. Notice that the FBI immediately recognized that this is a hate crime targeting Catholics. Remember that, because we're going to come back to how differently this is being covered compared to other hate crimes. Principal Matthew DeBoer described the heroic actions of teachers and older children protecting younger ones, saying, "Children were ducked down, adults were protecting children, older children were protecting younger children." These were the people actually protecting children while politicians were already drafting gun control tweets. While the media keeps calling this a shooting or gun violence, the attacker's own manifesto proves this was premeditated terrorism specifically targeting Catholics and children. Here's what the establishment doesn't want you to know about what this monster posted online. The attacker posted an 11-minute video manifesto to YouTube, timed to go live during the attack. The video showed an arsenal of weapons covered in the names of previous mass shooters, including Adam Lanza from Sandy Hook, the Christchurch Mosque shooter, and the Tree of Life synagogue attacker. This wasn't random violence. This was hero worship of other terrorists. But it gets worse. The manifesto contained explicit anti-religious phrases, racial slurs, Holocaust references, and calls for Israel to fall and burn. One of the weapons had "Kill Donald Trump" written on it. The video showed a shooting target with the face of Jesus Christ on it, along with ammunition decorated with disturbing phrases and smiley faces. The 4-page handwritten manifesto began with, "I don't expect forgiveness. I do apologize for the effects of my actions will have on your lives," and continued with, "I was corrupted by this world and have learned to hate what life is." The individual described being morbidly obsessed with previous school shooters since 7th grade. Here's the part that proves premeditation. The attacker had been planning this for months, including scouting the church layout and looking for security weaknesses. Part of the manifesto was written in Russian and included a hand-drawn map of the church labeled "Annunciation by Memory." This monster specifically chose this target because it was full of vulnerable children and had minimal security. The attacker's mother had previously worked at the school and retired in 2021, meaning this individual had inside knowledge of the facility, the schedule, and the lack of security measures. This wasn't a random target. It was specifically selected for maximum impact against Catholic children. The FBI has all of this evidence. They know this was premeditated, anti-Catholic terrorism. They've classified it as a hate crime. But watch how the media coverage completely ignores the religious motivation while focusing entirely on the weapons used. Here's where the story becomes absolutely disgusting from a media coverage standpoint. Before these families even knew if their children were alive or dead, the gun control narrative was already being pushed by politicians and amplified by their allies in the press. Representative Ilhan Omar, who represents this district, had a statement ready within hours. "We cannot continue to fail our kids with the lack of federal action. It is beyond despicable that elected leaders are more concerned with appeasing the gun lobby than keeping our children safe." Notice the framing of that. This isn't about protecting children from anti-Catholic terrorists. It's about federal action against gun rights. Omar completely ignored the hate crime aspect, the anti-religious motivation, and the fact that this was terrorism against her own constituents' faith community. Former President Obama posted on social media, "We cannot allow ourselves to become numb to mass shootings. What happened today in Minneapolis is heartbreaking, after yet another act of unspeakable, unnecessary violence." He called it unnecessary violence, not terrorism, not a hate crime, just unnecessary violence. Minneapolis Mayor Jacob Frey was even more explicit. Don't just say this is about thoughts and prayers right now. These kids were literally praying. Think about the sick irony of that statement. He's mocking thoughts and prayers while describing children who were murdered while praying. Here's what none of these politicians mention. This attack succeeded because it targeted a soft target with no meaningful security. The attacker specifically chose a location full of vulnerable children with no armed protection. But instead of addressing that obvious security failure, they immediately pivoted to disarming law-abiding citizens. The media followed the same script. Headlines focus on gun violence and school shooting while bearing the anti-Catholic hate crime classification and the terrorist manifesto. They're treating this exactly like they treated the Nashville Christian school attack. Minimize the religious targeting, maximize the gun control messaging. Meanwhile, the same media that spent weeks analyzing every social media post and motivation when attacks target other religious communities suddenly has no interest in exploring why someone would specifically target Catholic children during prayer. Here's where the establishment's hypocrisy becomes impossible to ignore. The FBI immediately classified this as a hate crime targeting Catholics, but watch how differently this is being covered compared to other attacks on other religious communities. When the Tree of Life synagogue was attacked in Pittsburgh, the media spent months analyzing anti-Semitism, white supremacy, and the attacker's online presence. Every detail of the motivation was explored, and the religious targeting was front and center in coverage. When mosques have been attacked, the media immediately focuses on the Islamophobia, hate crime legislation, and protecting Muslim communities. The religious motivation is never downplayed or ignored. But when Catholic children are murdered during Mass by someone whose manifesto contained explicit anti-religious hatred, suddenly it's just gun violence, and the motivation becomes irrelevant. The attacker's manifesto contained Holocaust references, calls for Israel to burn, racial slurs, and explicit anti-religious hatred. This individual was obsessed with previous terrorist attacks, and specifically targeted Catholic children during prayer. But the media's coverage treats this like a random act of violence rather than the hate crime the FBI says it is. Here's the deeper truth they don't want you to recognize. Attacks on traditional Christian communities don't generate the same level of hate crime coverage because they don't serve the broader political narrative. Anti-Catholic terrorism can be used to attack Trump supporters or traditional values, so it gets reframed as gun violence instead. The same establishment that sees hate crimes everywhere when it serves their agenda suddenly goes blind when the victims are Catholic children and the solution might involve protecting religious communities rather than restricting constitutional rights. Notice how quickly the focus shifted from protecting Catholic schools to disarming Catholic families who might want to defend themselves and their communities. Here's the part of the story that should make every parent furious. This attack succeeded because we've systemically created defensive target zones and called them safe. The attackers specifically chose this location because it was full of vulnerable children with no meaningful security. The manifesto shows this monster scouted the facility, looked for security weaknesses, and planned the attack knowing there would be minimal resistance. Think about the math here. An evil individual with months to plan, inside knowledge of the facility, multiple weapons, and the element of surprise, targeting children who have been taught that adults will protect them. But those adults have been disarmed by police and law. This is the exact same pattern as the Nashville Covenant school attack, where another terrorist specifically targeted a Christian school known to have minimal security. These attackers aren't choosing these locations randomly. They're conducting risk assessments and choosing the softest possible targets. But instead of hardening these targets, our response is always make law-abiding citizens more vulnerable. Instead of putting armed security in schools, we debate whether teachers should be allowed to carry. Instead of recognizing that evil specifically targets defenseless victims, we argue about magazine capacity. The teachers and older children who protected younger ones during this attack were heroes, and are heroes, I should say. But they were forced into heroism because we've created a system that leaves them defenseless against planned evil. They did everything they could with nothing but their bodies to shield children from the terrorists with military-style weapons and months of planning. Every day we delay implementing real security measures in our schools and churches is another day we're gambling with children's lives. The next attack is being planned right now, make no doubt about it, and the attackers are studying our vulnerabilities just like this monster did. Step back and look at the bigger picture of what's really happening here. This wasn't just an attack on children. It was an attack on Catholic children during prayer by someone whose manifesto revealed deep hatred for traditional religion and reverence for previous terrorists who targeted faith communities. The attacker chose the most sacred moment possible, children at prayer during Mass, and turned it into a scene of horror. This was designed to traumatize not just the immediate victims, but the entire Catholic community and anyone who believes in protecting innocence. But here's what the establishment fears most. If Americans recognize this as part of a broader pattern of attacks on traditional faith communities, they might start demanding real protection instead of accepting thoughts and prayers and gun control as their only responses. The same forces that have spent decades removing religion from public life, mocking traditional values, and promoting moral relativism are now shocked that someone would specifically target religious children? They've created a culture where evil is explained away and good is ridiculed. Then act surprised when evil strikes at the heart of goodness. This attack reveals the spiritual dimension of our current crisis that nobody wants to acknowledge. When a society systemically undermines faith, family, and traditional moral foundations, evil doesn't disappear, it gets emboldened. The attacker's manifesto shows someone consumed by cynicism, hatred, and obsession with previous terrorists. This isn't a gun problem or a mental health problem. It's a spiritual problem manifesting in the most evil way possible. The 30-day news cycle is already moving on from this attack, but the lessons need to be permanent and the changes need to be immediate. Every religious institution in America should be conducting security assessments right now. Not to live in fear, but to acknowledge that evil specifically targets places of worship because they represent everything evil hates: innocence, faith, community, and moral authority. Armed security at religious schools and during religious services isn't militarization. It's recognition of reality. The attackers are already armed and planning. The question is whether we're going to meet that threat with professional protection or continued vulnerability. Parents need to demand real answers from their schools and churches about security measures. Not general assurances, but specific protocols for armed threats, escape routes, communication systems, and response training. Law enforcement needs to treat every attack on religious communities as potential terrorism and investigate the broader networks and influences. This attacker didn't develop these ideas in isolation. There are online communities promoting this kind of violence that need to be dismantled. Most importantly, we need to stop pretending that evil can be regulated away, while good people remain defenseless. Every gun law proposed in response to this attack would have done nothing to prevent it, because the attacker followed all existing laws right up until the moment they decided to murder children. The only thing that stops evil is good people who are prepared to meet it with overwhelming force. Everything else is just political theater performed over the bodies of innocents. Step back and look at what evil accomplished today, and how our system responded. 8 and 10-year-old children were murdered while praying. 17 others were shot. And within hours, the focus shifted to disarming law-abiding citizens rather than protecting innocent victims. The FBI correctly identified this as domestic terrorism and a hate crime targeting Catholics. The manifesto proves this was premeditated anti-religious violence by someone obsessed with previous terrorists. But the media coverage treats it like random gun violence because hate crimes against traditional Christians don't serve the approved narrative. Meanwhile, the same politicians demanding gun control represent communities where armed security protects them every day. They'll have armed guards at their next press conference about gun violence, while advocating that religious schools remain defenseless. This is how evil operates in a civilization. It targets the most innocent and vulnerable while the system focuses on disarming their potential protectors. It strikes at the heart of faith communities while the establishment pretends religion has nothing to do with it. The transformation of how we protect our children in faith communities needs to start immediately. Not with more laws restricting good people, but with real security protecting innocent people from the evil that specifically targets them. The establishment will use this attack to push the same failed policies that enabled it in the first place. They'll ignore the anti-Catholic terrorism, dismiss the security failures, and focus entirely on restricting constitutional rights. But the families of those murdered children deserve better than political theater. The Catholic community deserves recognition that they were targeted for their faith, not random victims of gun violence. And American parents deserve honest leadership about the real threats facing their children. This monster specifically chose Catholic children during prayer because they represented everything evil hates: innocence, faith, and moral authority. The response reveals everything about whose side of our institutions are really on. If we want to honor those murdered children, we protect other children from suffering the same fate. Not with thoughts and prayers alone, but with the kind of overwhelming protective force that makes evil think twice about targeting innocence. Let me close with something personal. As a Catholic myself, today's attack hits particularly close to home. I know what it means to send your children to Mass, to watch them fold their little hands in prayer, to trust the sacred space of the church is a place of safety and peace, not because I'm a parent myself yet, but because I was one of those children. Every Catholic parent listening to this has imagined their own children sitting in those pews, and the thought is almost unbearable. Tonight, there are parents in Minneapolis who will never again watch their 8-year-old or 10-year-old kneel in prayer. There are families whose faith has been tested in the most horrific way possible. There are children who survived but will carry these memories forever. There's an entire Catholic community that has to grapple with the reality that they were targeted specifically for their faith. But I also think about the teachers who threw themselves between danger and children, the older students who protected the younger ones, the first responders who ran toward the gunfire, the medical teams who worked to save every life they could. In the face of absolute evil, ordinary people chose to be heroes. That's what faith communities do. They create people willing to sacrifice for others, people who see every child as precious, people who believe that good must actively confront evil. The attacker chose to target Catholic children because he knew they represented the kind of innocence and faith that stands against everything evil promotes. Our prayers tonight are with every family affected by this tragedy. Our anger is reserved for the evil that caused it and the systems that enabled it. And our commitment is to ensure that this never happens again to any child, in any church, anywhere in America. That's a wrap for another edition of O'Connor's Right Stand. I know this was a difficult episode. It was at parts hard for me to get through. But these conversations are exactly why this show exists. And if you do have little children, make sure to give them an extra hug and tell them how much you love them today. Or for that matter, every day. If this helped you understand what really happened today and what needs to happen next, share it with someone who needs to hear the truth our institutions won't tell them. And if you haven't already, make sure to follow me on X at O'Connor Stand. Some big changes are coming to the show soon, and I want to make sure you're the first to know. Until then, remember that evil counts on good people being unprepared and unwilling to face reality. Don't give evil that advantage. Keep holding the line unapologetically. This is John O'Connor, signing off.